Hello and welcome to my video all about how to weave in miniature. Weaving is an extremely versatile craft which you can start with very little, but no matter how you do it, all of the core techniques always remain the same. You must have evenly spaced slots, nails or pins to hold the warp thread in place, and you then go in and out of the warp thread using the weft thread. And in very basic terms, that's all there is to weaving. When you're weaving, you will do so on something called a loom. You can buy many different types of loom, or you can make your own simple loom at home. The usual methods of making your own loom include cutting slots into cardboard, hammering nails into scrap wood, inserting wooden dowels into drilled holes in wood, or even cutting notches into twigs. There are even different shapes of loom, including circular and triangular. Today though, I'm going to be sticking with the usual rectangular loom. I really wanted to find a way of weaving in miniature, and eventually I came up with this pin weaving technique. It's very simple and very effective, and what you're going to need is as follows: a cork sanding block, some map pins which have small round heads, some scissors, a fork, a comb or 5 cotton buds and some sellotape, a metal yarn needle and also a couple of large plastic yarn needles, a scrap piece of thin stiff card, a ruler, a wooden skewer, a cocktail stick or a thin twig for hanging the weaving from, and also some thread to use as the warp and some threads and yarns to use as the weft. For the warp thread, which is the thread that's going to run vertically throughout the whole weaving, I used size 8 cotton crochet thread in white. And for the weft, I'm going to be using some size 8 cotton crochet thread again, in white and in red, as well as some double knit yarn, also called medium or worsted weight yarn, in green. Okay, so to begin, we're going to put one line of map pins along one short edge of the cork block. You can use a ruler to make sure they're all spaced out evenly, but I just did it by eye. I ended up placing 10 pins into my cork block with at least 5mm between each one. However closely you position your pins, just make sure that there's enough space between each of the round heads to fit the warp thread through. And then do exactly the same at the other end of the cork block, but this time a few centimetres from the edge. This second line of pins must be exactly opposite the first line of pins, i.e. it's the mirror image. And then it's time to add the warp thread. So we knot one end of the warp thread and secure it with a pin at the end of the cork block where we've left a bit of space. Then we take the thread past the pin at the end of that second row of pins and start winding the thread back and forth between the pins in a kind of zigzag path. So for each pin you take the thread halfway round, you don't wrap the thread completely around the pins, and then onto the next pin on the opposite pin row. You then cut the thread with a few inches to spare, knot the end and secure it with another pin. You should be starting and finishing the warping of your loom at the same end of the cork block. Make sure before you secure the end of the warp thread that there is tension in the thread. You don't want it to be loose at all. Then there's one or two things we need to do before we start weaving. The first thing is to slide a narrow strip of thin card between the warp threads at the bottom of the loom. In weaving, you nearly always start at the bottom of the loom and work upwards and away from you. This card helps to keep the warp threads level, and it also acts as a kind of spacer, which will help us with finishing off the bottom of the weaving later on. During the weaving process, you're going to need a fork or a comb to help squash the weft threads together, just to keep them nice and neat. However, if you don't have a fork or a comb to use, then you can do what I did instead, which is to make your own tool. So I chopped the ends off 5 cotton buds and then taped the other ends together to make my own fork tool. And then we can start weaving. To begin, you should use a thread rather than a yarn, and it should be of similar thickness to the warp threads. Then use a metal needle to feed one end of your weft thread in and out of the warp threads, just above the strip of card. The purpose of this is to secure the end of the weft thread into your weaving. So you only need it to go in and out of about 8 warp threads, because this will keep it in place. Once you have just the end of this thread woven in, you can then use your fork tool to press the thread lightly against the strip of card. You should use the fork tool after every line of your weaving, because it keeps all of the lines nice and horizontal and neat. We're now going to do a few rows of what is called plain weave, which is the regular in and out weaving technique. The reason for adding plain weave to start with is to create a stable base for the weaving. If we did the tassel section first, for instance, this would be difficult to keep in place when removing the weaving from the loom at the end. So you need to estimate how much of this weft thread you're going to need, and then cut it to size. Then you need to feed this thread into your yarn needle. Now we need to weave back and forth for around 6 rows. If on the partial row that we've already done, the weft thread goes under that first warp thread, then on the next row, that weft thread will go over the first warp thread, and vice versa. You really don't want to distort the threads, so when you pull this thread through, it's best that it lies in a diagonal line or in a kind of arch shape. You don't want to pull it tightly across or tightly downwards onto the rest of your weaving. In order to keep the warp threads nice and vertical and straight, you'll see me often hold the threads in place at the beginning of the row as I pull the weft through. This just stops the outer warp threads from being pulled inwards. You then use your fork tool to press this row of thread onto the previous row. Then we just weave another row in exactly the same way, but in the opposite direction. And then use the fork tool. And you simply repeat this for about 6 rows. We're now going to add some fringing to the weaving, and we're going to do this by adding stitches called riot knots. To make these, we first need to cut 1 piece of yarn per pair of warp threads. So in my case, I have 20 individual warp threads, so I need 10 lengths of yarn. Each of these lengths of yarn will probably be at least a few inches, and they need to be just over twice the length that you want the finished fringing to be. It's best to make these pieces longer than you need, because you can always cut them shorter later on. Then, to make a riot knot, you need to take one of these pieces of yarn and place it horizontally over the warp threads. Next, push each end of the yarn down towards the cork block, either side of the pair of warp threads. Then use your plastic yarn needle to bring each end of the yarn up between those 2 warp threads. You then just need to hold the two tails of yarn and pull them downwards to drag the knot to the bottom of the weaving. Try and keep the two tails of yarn equal in length. Then just repeat the same for every strand of yarn and each pair of warp threads. I'm now going to show you the process again, but this time with photographs. So you take a piece of yarn and place it horizontally over the warps, with the centre of the yarn over the pair of warp threads that you want to add the knot to. Then push the ends of the yarn down towards the cork block, either side of the pair of warp threads. Then use your plastic needle to bring each end of the yarn up between the two warp threads. Then pull that knot down towards the bottom of the weaving. And repeat this all the way across the row. Next, use the same method as before to add stripes of plain weave in differently coloured threads and yarns. I started with green yarn, first cutting a length of yarn by estimating how much I would need to use, then weaving it in and out of the warp threads using my yarn needle. As I did previously to secure the end of the thread, I first wove the start of the piece of yarn part way across the row. Then I did 4 rows of plain weave, just going in and out of the warp threads. Always remember to use the fork tool between each row. I then experimented by doing a few rows using a double length stitch. So basically I went over 2 warp threads, under 2 warp threads, over 2, under 2, etc. across the whole length of the row. The result was a more voluminous and longer stitch, and if you like the look of it, then feel free to do that instead of plain weave. To finish weaving a stripe, I just weave part way across a row. I then did a plain weave stripe with white thread and then with red thread. As you can see here. Although obviously you can choose whatever colours you want to use. Next, I wanted to add 2 triangle shapes in white thread, surrounded by green yarn, all in plain weave. So I started weaving from the 6th warp thread in, and did plain weave across 10 warp threads, before changing direction and weaving back across those 10 threads. As usual, I used the fork tool between each row. I then repeated that back and forth once more. Then for the next row I started on the 7th warp thread from the end, did plain weave across 8 warp threads and then came back again. I then repeated that back and forth. And you just keep decreasing the length of the rows in this fashion until you get to the pointed end of the triangle shape. For some of the decreases, I did 3 rows at each length rather than just 2. I did this to elongate the triangle shape, to stop it from looking too squashed. And for the last step, I just wrapped the weft once around the 11th warp thread, which is one of the central warp threads. Once you've finished weaving a stripe, feel free to leave the yarn tail hanging at the side of the weaving. Don't worry about doing this because at the end we're going to weave these yarn tails in. Just make sure that the yarn tails you leave are long enough to thread onto a needle. Then it was time to fill the area around the triangle with plain weave using the green yarn. I started weaving just above the red thread. weaving all of the way up one side until I could weave a full row above the triangle. And then weaving all the way back down the other side of the triangle. On each row, I made sure that the green yarn changed direction on the warp thread next to the white triangle. It is possible to interlock the thread in the triangle with the surrounding colour by having the green yarn change direction on the same warp as where the triangle shape begins. However, I wouldn't do this with mismatched thread and yarn weights, as I'm using here. I therefore basically kept the triangle and the surrounding colour separate. I then repeated all of these steps to make a smaller white triangle, surrounded again by the green yarn. You want to leave at least 1.5 to 2 centimeters of the warp thread free at the top of your weaving, as these threads will need to be tied around the bamboo skewer, or dowel or twig or whatever you're using, to hang the weaving up. I don't have a video of the whole process of removing the weaving from the loom, because it's a fiddly process and my hands just got in the way, so I'm going to have to use photos to demonstrate instead. So once you've finished weaving, simply cut the warp threads at the top of each loop, where the thread loops around the pin. Then you tie each pair of warp threads together around your wooden skewer. At the bottom of the weaving, you remove the strip of card and then repeat the same steps for the warp threads. So you cut the warp threads where they loop around the pins, but this time you don't have to leave space for a skewer. So you simply tie the pairs of warp threads together to secure them. Just don't tie them too tight, as this may distort the weaving. Once these threads are knotted, you can cut off the excess thread, or you can weave in that excess thread. To weave in, you simply take the thread or yarn tail and feed it through a yarn needle. Then you just sew that tail into the back of your weaving. And you do the same thing to weave in all the thread tails and yarn tails at the back of your weaving. In this photo of the back of my weaving, you should be able to see where I wove in, vertically, some of the yarn tails. The aim of this step is to hide all of those thread and yarn tails at the back of the weaving, and also to secure them to stop any unravelling. And then all you need to do is attach another piece of thread to the top of the wooden skewer, just to be able to hang it up. And that's it, you've now finished your miniature weaving. I really hope you've enjoyed this project, and thank you very much for watching.